Okay, Jan, so I think we'll start. A big welcome to everybody. My name is Liam and I'm the CEO of Professional Counselling and Psychotherapy Seminars Ireland. And I'm very excited tonight to have a free webinar with Jan Winhall. A big welcome, Jan.
Thank you, Liam. It's great to be here.
Yeah, really nice to see you. And I'm really kind of looking forward to hearing what you have to say, because I think it's fascinating what you've done to integrate the polyvagal theory with focusing. So I'm really looking forward to hearing it. So tonight's free webinar is really a taster for June's webinar series. And June's webinar series is called Treating Trauma and Addiction with the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model. And Robert, you might put up the link if anybody is interested in purchasing the webinar. Just to say, there's a super early bird price on the webinar at the moment, which finishes on Sunday. So if you are interested in attending in June, I'd suggest that you buy it now. And just before you start, Jan, I'm just going to go through a few practicalities just to make tonight as easy as possible. So, and I think most people are probably very familiar with Zoom at this stage, but just in case people are not, any kind of tech issues, what we would suggest is that you'd log off and log back on again with the link provided. If it is any of the issues persist, you can give me an email, and my email is liam@pcpsi.ie. And the schedule for tonight is Jan is going to start now very shortly, and Jan's presentation will go on for about 30 or 40 minutes. But we leave Jan about maybe 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. And what we usually do Q&A in two ways. So if anybody is interested in coming on live, what we suggest you do, as I look at my screen on the right-hand side, there's a raise hand function. So if you press the raise hand function, I'll see your name and I can call out your name. And when you come on, all you need to do is to unmute yourself and turn on your mic. But that, that some people like coming on and some people don't. So if you don't like coming on, and you're very free to send in a question. And again, on my right-hand side is the Q&A function, and you can send questions in through the Q&A function. And just to say, Jan is an author, teacher, and psychotherapist, and Jan is from Toronto in Canada. And Jan is the coordinator with the International Focusing Institute. And I know, Jan, you're going to go into a bit more detail how you got interested in the whole area of polyvagal theory and how you started to integrate polyvagal theory with focusing, which is obviously the main focus of your book. So without further ado, I'll just hand you over now to Jan.
Hello, everybody. So last June, I released my new book, Treating Trauma and Addiction with the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model. And really, the book is a story of how I started my work over 40 years ago now. I was working with a group of young women who were incest survivors, and I ended up fresh out of graduate school and leading this group. And really, so much of the work and the model that I formed over the years has come from what I learned from those young women in the group. And at the time I was working, it was in a psychiatric hospital. And so the model in the hospital was very pathologizing. Most of these young women were being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And the environment in which they were being treated was, frankly, I found disrespectful and really not understanding their behavior and what was happening for them. So I kind of ignored the pathologizing model and I went on a journey. And so my book is really the journey of how I tried to figure out a different way of being able to be with people who are really struggling with significant trauma. And back then, this was about 40 years ago, The first sort of group of people that helped me with this were feminist therapists, because we were really interested in listening to the body. And then after a period of time, for example, Judith Herman's wonderful book came out, Trauma and Recovery, where she really led us in terms of understanding how to listen to the body and to appreciate that these self-harming behaviors that these young women were engaged in, that often became addictive, were ways of being able to manage really dysregulated states in the body. So this is not new. We knew this back then. And we also really understood as feminist therapists and appreciated and honored the adaptive nature of these behaviors, but we didn't really understand them. Over time, though, I really tried to source out different people to figure this out, what was going on here. And the first person that really I encountered that really helped with this was actually Jean Genlin's work. And Genlin is the father of the term felt sense. So I find often people they use the term a lot now, but they don't really understand what it's all about. So I trained under Janlin for many decades, and really it was just an incredible opportunity to learn from him and from the people that were teaching around him how to help people to begin to notice and settle in their bodies without immediately becoming panicked or shutting down. And so Genlin noticed this too. He was a student of Carl Rogers. And together with Rogers, they studied voices, that the recordings of psychotherapy practices. And they noticed these big pauses in the sessions with therapists and clients, that the sessions where clients reported that they were really doing well. So he asked about that. What is that? What's this kind of silent place that's happening here? And essentially what he found was that people were pausing, and they were going inside, and they were connecting with their body's information about how they were experiencing life. And this really makes sense, right? It's like if you are an integrated person, if you live in your body, you're connected to your whole felt sense of an experience, meaning you're connected to your thoughts. If you just even want to pause right now to try this. So slowing things down and connecting to what you're thinking in this moment, and then what you're feeling emotionally about this moment. And then how your body carries this physically. So noticing maybe in the chest if there's a tightness or an expansion or a kind of flattening or folding in, how your limbs feel. It gives us so much information about how we're living our lives. And then the other part of the felt sense that I like to talk about are the memories. So in this moment, is there something that feels familiar that might take you back to another experience that's like this? And then as we stay with that, if we're present and we're feeling, in polyvagal terms, we would call the ventral vagus grounded enough, then we start to formulate what's called a felt sense in the body. And so what I noticed in Gendlin's work, and he noticed it too, was that when you stay with this experience for a while, especially if there's something about it that feels uncomfortable, tight or squiggly, or then you start to get a sense of what it needs. So we would ask into it, what's that all about? What does that uncomfortable place need in the body? And we tend to focus in partnerships. So there's the co-regulation piece in polyvagal theory. When you're with another person and they show you compassion and they sit with you and they ask, well, what's in there? You know, what does this need or what does this want? And then sometimes something begins to unfold and release, and we just feel better. It's like having a really good chat with a friend when you're upset. Maybe tears come, the friend is with you, the body releases, and you feel better. You feel more like you're in that grounded ventral place again. That's what we call in focusing the felt shift in the body. And Judith Herman in Trauma and Recovery actually talks about this. She talks about how people know in the body that when jolts occur, it somehow releases something. So those jolts that happen with addictions are ways of releasing and shifting, but they go into dysregulated states. So we'll get into that when I share my model with you. But these kind of more smooth shifts in the body that Gendlin noticed, they are what I began to understand and put together in the model as shifts in neurophysiological states in the autonomic nervous system. So I'm going to share with you these steps of focusing that Gendlin then put together as a way of trying to articulate what this process is like. So here's the 6 steps that he outlined. He started with clearing a space, which is just a beautiful way of, it's like a meditation practice. It's a way of beginning to settle inside, because we can't really feel into a felt sense if we're in these dysregulated states of flight, fight, or freeze, or folding in and shutting down. The felt sense comes with, you know, we may feel some of that in the beginning when we enter the body, but as we move through the steps into clearing and then finding a felt sense, we begin to move into a more ventral state, but particularly with the help of another person who we teach to be a very skilled, deep listener into the process. Then we move into getting a handle, we call it. It's like if I'm here with you now and I feel grounded, I'm in ventral, and I feel also some sympathetic surge of excitement because I love sharing the work and being with people. So there's a bit of a sense of that and a little tightening around the chest, but it's settled, it's quite grounded. And then I would look for a word or maybe a phrase, or often it's an image, because focusing is a right hemisphere practice. A lot of it is. So an image might come of, you know, an image that comes for me now is just that moment of greeting Liam as we say hello, and that wonderful sense of community that comes when we're with people that are like-minded. So that fills me with a kind of warm sense of the handle. Then your listener, or you, if you're focusing alone, would go to the next step of resonating that handle back, that warm image with maybe a gesture of feeling around the top part of my chest. And saying that handle for this lovely place can also become a resource that you can build on and access when you're feeling really dysregulated. And so we really, we collect these handle places in body cards, which I will show you. Then asking into the felt sense is a way of really continuing to have it evolve and move and shape over time. And this is often where you really feel that sense of the shift that happens in the body, where you might be moving from a flight-fight place down and settling into a really grounded, more grounded place in the body. And then the sixth step is welcoming. And this is a really important piece of taking the time to pause again and really appreciating what came from the wisdom of the body, which regrettably has been very denigrated, I think, in our culture, and certainly denigrated or not integrated into our traditional ways of treating people. So what I did then is I began to work on making a model. This is much more recent, that integrated polyvagal theory with the felt sense, with focusing practice. So here it is all together. This is the simpler client form that we made. We call it the 6 Fs. My clients basically helped me to make it over time because they found it so helpful. They would, for example, download it onto their phone or stick it on the fridge or use it in their journal as a way of what we call orienting to the felt sense polyvagal model, to help them to have a sense of, where am I in the nervous system and where am I in the felt sense in my body? So the model really works with 2 basic embodied processes. Neuroception, Steve Porges' word for how bodies notice and detect where we are in the environment and how safe we are and what state we need to be in order to adapt. And then also interoception, the practice of noticing inside the body, both in terms of sensation, but also in the felt sense in terms of noticing how sensation and all of the information that comes into the body carries meaning. And that's a very big part of felt sense, which I think is sometimes missed. So we broke it down to make it even simpler for people to get in the beginning into the 3 main branches of the autonomic nervous system. So down in the bottom is flock, we called it. This is the place, the ventral place where people flock together. This is what we're doing right now. We're coming together to learn and to be together and to exchange and to be curious about how these new ways that we can understand and be together. And then up on the right is fight flight. So that's the sympathetic place. We kind of made it like a tangled ball of wool. It's kind of red because it feels like that often in the body. That's that, adrenaline pump that starts to mobilize when we feel uncomfortable or we don't have enough safety in the environment, which right now in the world, we don't. And in many ways in the world, many people never do. And so that's a big problem and part of why we really need to pay attention to the body and to the autonomic nervous system. We have so many people in the world living in marginalized communities that never feel safe. And so then on the left is fold. This is the collapse place that Steve Porges really developed for us in terms of the dorsal vagus. So those are the 3 main branches of Steve Porges' version of the autonomic nervous system. And then these are the blended states, and this is important to get. So blended states are a mixture of 2 different pathways in the nervous system. And the one on the bottom right of fun and fired up, this is where I often feel in my life these days, doing a lot of teaching and writing and just really having a great time disseminating new information that we're learning and passing along from Steve and Polyvagal Institute and the Focusing Institute. So it's fun to play and to feel a sense of intertwining or blending of the ventral branch of the vagus in flock and the sympathetic branch in fight, where we have some adrenaline pumping. You can really see and feel into this blended state when you hear children playing, because often they'll start off laughing and having fun. It's a wonderful sound to hear. And then somebody gets hurt and it shifts very quickly. The autonomic nervous system shifts into fight, where they're punching, or flight, where they're running away. And, you know, that dynamic of flight fight is a very common place where people get stuck, right, in the nervous system. Then on the left is flow. So this is a blending of the ventral part of the vagus with flock, and then fold, immobilization. So these are where our practices around focusing happen, meditation, mindfulness, lovemaking. It's the place that Steve calls being safe in the arms of a loved one, where you feel safe to fall back and you feel supported by somebody who's there behind you. And then this is where we come to the piece around addiction that I put together. This is the top part of fixate freeze. This is the blended state of sympathetic fight, flight, mobilization, and dorsal shutting down because there's no escape. So what I began to understand addictions as are blended, they create this blended or intertwining state between the sympathetic surge and the numbing folding down. And so, for example, you'll see, go to the full model now, you can see how people will often start in fight flight, living in that adrenaline pumping, really uncomfortable, anxious or angry or both state. And they'll move into freeze, into addictions like cutting the body, drinking a lot, unsafe sexual acting out, shopping. I mean, all of these behavioral, really, I think, I'm convinced you can really you can become addicted to pretty well anything that helps the body in a jolt to shift nervous states from sympathetic down to dorsal into numbing, or vice versa. From numbing, often what I found with the women in the group so long ago was that cutting the body was their way of jolting it to wake it up, because it felt so dead and horrible, actually, in the dorsal numbing state. So this is a bit more scary, but this is the clinician version of the model, and slowly we learn it over time. And in my book, I go through it in a lot of detail. So you see that the top half of the model is really the trauma feedback loop, where people are living in that flooded, mobilized, hyper-aroused state, and then also shutting down into the dorsal hypo-aroused state of dissociation. And what we say in polyvagal theory is that when there isn't enough safety, people will use addictions to be able to adapt to an environment. And that this is actually not maladaptive. This is actually an adaptive attempt through addictions to survive. And therefore, we don't pathologize it. For me, I see it as the body's kind of backup plan when you don't have enough safety at the bottom half of the model to be living in that feedback loop of play, social engagement, and stillness. These are the polyvagal words for this. So this is a real paradigm shift. It's really revolutionizing the way that we understand addiction, because we see it then not as a brain disease, we see it as a learned behavior, a learned habit that comes from neuroplasticity, that the brain learns these new ways of being able to cope, which are very, much related to dopamine and oxytocin. Particularly, you see oxytocin with sex addiction, which I'm convinced is an absolute pandemic in and of its own. And I think we don't talk about it enough. We need to be able to talk about all addictions, but particularly sex addiction, because it tends to come early on in the form of masturbating, which is a very adaptive way to manage when there just isn't enough safety in your environment, particularly if you're a little kid. So often with real childhood trauma, which we know is very related to addiction, we know through wonderful Felides ACEs studies and whatever, that this is, eating and sex addiction are often the first ones that will surface because they're available to young children. So very important to be able to ask clients about this. And then what we do is we harness the autonomic nervous system as a collaborator in the healing. We bring the body in and the autonomic nervous system to work with us rather than ignoring the body response and just getting into kind of these really sort of top down and quite controlling ways of trying to manage the addiction. Of course, because it's very hard to change. But through a polyvagal and a felt sense lens, we just welcome and understand them as adaptive. And then we track how the person is doing in terms of their capacity to move through the dysregulated states into more grounding. And as they do that, the addictions disappear slowly over time, sometimes quickly. So here's an example of the body cards that we use to help clients to really visualize and embody through the drawing the felt sense of these different autonomic states. You see how the model really comes together here. So here's an example of a body card in the sympathetic nervous system, fight, flight. And, it really helps to use color and to represent the imagery on a body card. And we actually have 4 different types of body cards that people can use that fit and match more of how they experience their own bodies in terms of size and whatever. And so then there are also places where you could write on it the different aspects of the felt sense, the thoughts and the memories and the feelings and the physical sensations. And when we do these body cards from the thought place of grounding, they become really powerful resources to use to help to find that neural pathway back to the felt sense of ventral. So we have practices that we do and teach clients over time. And then I'm really excited because I've just actually launched the Embodied Assessment, a treatment tool. It's chapter 11 in my book. We call it EAT for short. So I describe it in the book, but this is the tool that you can download on my website. And I actually will include this as part of in the training, so people would get a free code for it. And I developed this because there wasn't one. There wasn't an assessment tool that incorporated the body in a really experiential way. And so I thought, well, I'll make it. So I kind of described what I do. And so when you download it, you get this. It's there's an assessment overview. There's a process recording table, which I will show you. There are what we call 8 components of the EAT, which are detailed in my book. They're different practices and tools that I've drawn from, for example, Dan Siegel's beautiful work, and Bonnie Badenoch, who I really love her work too. The 9 domains of integration is actually Siegel's assessment tool. And I really liked it. And it does include some embodiment, but I added it to this assessment, which also then really brings in the felt sense and polyvagal theory. And then I delineated 8 focusing oriented therapy strategies that we use, and made a space for other strategies that other modalities that people may use, because the model is generic. It's just really about how to bring the body into your practice. And so if you're a somatic experiencing practitioner, or you're into inner family systems, or whatever the kind of model you're using, you can use this to be able to bring in felt sense and the polyvagal theory. And also, I made it so that it can also be a process recording for clinical notes. So you can open it in Excel, and then you can track sessions that are happening and use them as your clinical notes. And you can download everything, but you can also keep it obviously on your computer. So when you open this, this opens up into Excel, and we kind of moved it along, and it's a very experiential assessment tool. The bottom part of this is like the cheat sheet. It's a simple sort of version of what's in my book. It looks like a lot, and it is a lot of different tools to learn, but we take our time and move through them and learn each of them. There's no rush. Most people have already got a certain way that they're working anyway. We always start with orienting to that felt sense polyvagal model that I showed you with the 6 F's with clients. So we start by thinking about where is the client in their nervous system. And sometimes I absolutely introduce the model. I actually have a big one in my office. And we trace where people are. And then also we do then some maybe focusing and grounding work, and then look towards the end of the session at, well, where did you go? What was your pathway in your body, through your nervous system, through accessing that felt sense experience? So we have 8 components here, which are described in the book. The experiencing scale is the other one that I use a lot. And this is from Jean Gendlin's work in focusing. I love this because it's a scale. If you look over here at experiencing scale, there are 7 steps. So the first one is kind of like your client is reading the news. The experiencing scale is a way of rating how deeply embodied, how integrated the client is in their experiencing. So really, how ventral are they? How present are they? So number 1 is a very dissociated kind of state where you're not feeling into the experience. And then it moves into being able in step 2 to talk a little bit about emotion, but without relating it to yourself. In step 3, you're talking about your emotions, you're relating it to yourself, but you're not really in your body. And this is where a lot of therapy is. A lot of therapy takes place here. You're talking about what happened, oh, this happened and that happened, and I felt this about it and that about it, but you don't go down into the body. And so Jenlin said, okay, change happens in the body. It happens through the felt shift. And then, of course, what makes sense with polyvagal theory is, yeah, change happens in the autonomic nervous system. And when that happens and that shift occurs, the story follows the state. I think this is what Dana talked about. And that's such a clever way of saying it, right? Story follows state, or as Steve would say, that it's the intervening variable. So depending on what autonomic state you're in, if you're in flight fight, for example, the story you're going to tell yourself about something is going to be flooded with fear and anxiety and or anger, because that's the state the body's in. If you shift back from that triggered state into ventral grounding, oh, the story changes. Joe Blow wasn't mad at me. I was just afraid and anxious at the time. He was saying da 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 da, but he wasn't directing it towards me. So very important to be able to help our clients to move beyond just talking about the feelings, especially when you're working with addiction. So moving down then into step 4, you start to enter into the body. How does this feel in my body? And you'll see clients will like look away, and there's a place where they're starting to go in. Then they can drop right down into 6. There's a felt shift that occurs. And in 7, a really in-depth exploration, a welcoming of what came. So how's our time? There also is a way of I created called the Felt Sense Polyvagal Dialogue, which is also in my book with a case example. This is how we can work with couples, and also we can work with families. And then Dan Siegel's work with the 9 domains of integration, the trauma egg, some of you may be familiar with. The 3 circles I use a lot in the addiction work. So let's go to that. So here's the 3 circle practice that you would often I would use with clients when they're working on addiction. What I did here, this is Patrick Cairns' work as a tool, we use it, but I integrated the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model into the circles, basically bringing in the autonomic nervous system into understanding addictions. So here in this inner circle are the this is the blended state of addiction. This is where clients would fill in. So you can download these from the EAT assessment. And then clients fill in this middle inner circle, what behaviors they want to change. And we use a harm reduction model to be able to do that. The middle circle are the triggers, the triggered states of that activate flight, fight, and then fold. And the outer circle is the good life. These are the behaviors that we want clients to be able to build over time, the ventral practices, so that when they feel this middle state, instead of going in and using, they move out to a practice that is really healing and ventral. And I think I included in this an example of the circles. Well, maybe not. Yeah, here it is. So here we have an example. So in the inner circle, you work slowly, you work with the nervous system in the client, what's happening in their body, and what they feel ready to be able to commit to for accountability, because that's really important in addiction. And so you can see in this one, this is a particular pattern that often is coupled with watching pornography, with smoking weed, and eating sweets or salty stuff. It's a very common pattern, and they often all go together. So there's a lot of work in helping people to shift these and separate and uncouple them. And this is something that happens over time with the commitment, usually with people. And then we build in accountability by having these daily practices where people orient to the felt sense model and get a sense of where am I? And where am I in the 3 circles? So when you have the 3 circles and you have the model, you're really giving your clients a lot in terms of how to manage their embodied process and to keep accountability. You see for in the middle circle here for this person, a lot of what often activates addiction, as we know, is loneliness. Sometimes it's systemic. It's racism. It's feeling targeted, conflicts at work, fighting with your partner, whatever those things are, COVID, for example, that activate these dysregulated states in the body. And then really building with your client the outer circle. What are the things that bring you a sense of connection? So one that I use a lot is focusing partnerships. We have a community called Focusing on Boredom. And a lot of my clients are in focusing partnerships. We work in groups in addiction, and they partner up with each other, and they're accountable to each other, but in a way that's very embodied. So they will maybe book 45 minutes a week and take turns focusing and listening to each other. And then also just connecting in with how are you doing with the process. So the check-in with the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model. Things like cuddling your pets, it's become also a really big thing during COVID, and beautiful thing. I mean, pets are mammals often, and as mammals, we really respond to each other and co-regulate with each other. Another example might be something like playing the piano, drawing and painting, journaling, playing hockey. Obviously, lots around social engagement, which of course is is really compromised in addiction, because addiction is mostly often about going inwards and isolating. Even if you're with other folks, you may be experiencing some sense of social engagement. I've been talking about this recently with Steve Porges, but it's very compromised, because the most important thing in that state is what it is that you're externally using to regulate, to manage yourself in your life. And I think that's it. So I'm going to end. I have no idea where our time is. Usually I'm much more vigilant about it, but I'm going to come back now.
I think you're
That's
doing
probably pretty good.
You're doing good time-wise, Jan.
Okay, good.
I think we have about 18 minutes left, so
Great, perfect. It's nice to interact.
absolutely. And listen, a big thanks for offering anybody that signs up a free copy of the assessment tool. I really appreciate that. And
there's a lot in that, but I just gave you a little overview.
Okay, super. So we'll ask some questions, and if anybody would like to come on and ask a question live, just put up your hand, please. But while we're waiting for that, Jan, do you want me to call out the questions, or can you see the questions yourself?
Oh, I can go to chat.
Okay.
Here we go. Thank you so much for this interesting information, for your clear explanation. Speaking slowly and clearly is so helpful, especially for foreigners like me in France.
I think they're probably in the Q&A, Jan, rather than the chat.
Oh, okay. How do I get there? Oh, here we go.
Okay.
I get it. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. I wanted to ask, Jan is aware of any research on this kind of work with clients and have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. I'm doing a research master's at the moment in the area of working with these clients using methods that combine psychotherapy with the body. Research in working with the felt sense and the body with addiction, not specifically naming borderline personality disorder. Cynthia, I forget her last name, but I can let Liam know. She presented at the Integrating Trauma and Addiction workshop that we just did with Gabor Mate and Steve Porges. She's done a lot of work around working with addiction and embodiment, which is very rare. There is a chapter in the clinical applications of polyvagal theory that Steve wrote, I believe, on borderline personality. Maybe worth checking out with his trauma research center, the Kinsey Institute. They may know of some research on borderline personality disorder and embodiment. It's a pretty new area, very exciting. I'm hoping to do some research with the EAT, actually. But it's early days, so you have to really get in there online and start looking around specifically for BPD. But I would start with looking at that chapter in the clinical applications book and see what's listed at the end of the chapter in terms of references. That's where I would start. And also I can get you Cynthia's information and pass it along to Liam. So then Lucinda asked, what physiologically is happening when clients feel a felt sense? So when clients feel a whole felt sense,
I think it's a felt shift.
Oh, shift. Yeah. Yeah, that is fascinating. That is a real shift in the body that's occurring in the autonomic nervous system. So how that sense of neuroception, right? The body's awareness and wisdom to shift us into that ventral state when it feels safe enough in the environment. And that's when then the social engagement system is activated through that the upper part of the body in the ventral vagus. So that's above the diaphragm. The ventral vagus extends up through the ear and then up through the face. And so there's this kind of, this part of the vagus, the ventral part of the vagus comes online. And we shift into the place of feeling safer in the body and more connected to presence. Yeah. So it's above the diaphragm and activating into through the ear, because sound, and breath is really this powerful portals into the ventral part of the vagus nerve. So somebody, Laura asks, how do you work with folks who aren't ready to work on their addictions? Yeah, that's a really important question too. So, the thing is, in trauma and addiction, they've really developed as these two very separate fields, right? There's the addiction field and then there's the trauma field, and they're just starting to begin to integrate and talk to each other. But the body isn't like that. Bodies, when they're traumatized, very often we're using addictions in terms of being able to cope. So it really tells us that addiction is very, very prevalent in many of our trauma clients that we see. So what I really encourage people to do is to ask, because if you don't ask about addictions, often people who come in won't tell you. But if you normalize it, you say, how have you been coping with this? Like most people will find ways, the body will find its way to adapt, to help you. So very often people will be, they'll move into using drugs and alcohol a lot, or even things that kind of short-term hurt the body, but they help the body in the long term, they hurt the body in the long term, but they help in the short term, rather, in terms of numbing, right? And so if you normalize that, you kind of put it out there, people will start to tell you. And then as they start to tell you about addictions, you can begin then to work. So that's one avenue, is to don't be afraid to ask. And if you ask through normalizing it, and you have to be specific, to say, yeah, bodies do all kinds of things to be able to adapt, and it can feel really weird when you don't understand it. But when you understand the context tells the story. And when you give people that understanding, that they haven't done anything wrong or bad, that they are trying to adapt in ways that are often hurtful, but they also really help you, it really creates what I call a moment of liberation. It's what makes working with addiction through the polyvagal lens so wonderful, because you're giving people this sense of, I'm not crazy. My body took me there, to cutting, for example. When we cut the body, it releases endogenous opioids. And those endogenous opioids numb us. And that brings relief. So why wouldn't we do that? And it's not like it's conscious, it's an unconscious thing. The autonomic nervous system works, in very basic ways, right? But it makes sense. So I find when you ask, a lot of people will start to share because they feel safe with you, that you get it, and you've got something here that you can offer them around addiction that's new. It's new, but it's not new, because we knew this back 40 years ago, but we didn't have polyvagal theory to really help us to understand how those shifts occur in the nervous system. So would you consider that excessive use of sex is a way to shift emotional states? I'm working with a young girl engaging in risky sexual activity. Yeah, it absolutely can be. What I always say is we have to ask the client. If you ask, and you ask in a way that creates enough respect for the dignity of the person, together you will figure it out, what it's about. And often with this kind of behavior, it's twofold. It's both the releasing of endogenous opioids by going back to the scene in which the body learned to numb. So if you were sexually abused, your body learned to dissociate in that experience. The body will go back to that experience where the sense of it feels the same, and the body will release these endogenous opioids, which then shift into sometimes the only kind of relief that there is available, which is the dorsal vagus. So sometimes those behaviors tell the story of the abuse. Not always, but often they do. So you have to kind of figure out what is it about an addictive behavior that the person has chosen this particular behavior. Why this one, for example? Because there's always a reason for that. Why this one? It could be food, and it might be something like my grandmother, fed me when my parents were arguing all the time. So food became associated, right? We build these templates of arousal. And so we have to find out, well, what's in that arousal template? What does one thing it gets paired with another thing. So, what fires together then wires together. So grandma's loving kindness and then her feeding me something that tastes good goes together with a high arousal of fear in hearing my parents arguing with each other. And so these pairings have to be kind of noticed and then separated out. And as we work with the body, we check to see, how did you do this week? I was in like fold. A lot of the time I was in fold. You must have had a rough week. Well, let's look at that. What's your body telling you? So we're working with the body, with the autonomic nervous system, with the felt sense as a collaborator in the healing. The EAT assessment, if you just go on my website and scroll down, you'll see where there's courses that are happening, including this one that's listed. And then the EAT assessment is also there. And from, do you say Aiden? How do you say? Aiden. The model looks really interesting and it was so helpful. I work with addiction population, many of whom have experienced trauma, and once they come off substances, tend to struggle with active PTSD symptoms. Yeah, for sure. Would you advise that clients would need a period of substance-free stabilization before engaging in this work? No. I find that often clients are required to demonstrate a certain period of time whereby they can go without substances before they are accepted into relevant programs and therapies. And I fear that it's a catch-22 for clients, whereby they often need this type of work before they can manage their addictions. Yes, absolutely. We were just talking about this the other day. It's like you can't get into a treatment center until you've stopped. This makes no sense at all from an embodied perspective. We just go very slowly, obviously, and you don't touch into, the experiencing scale. You don't go down in there at all until you feel in your own body. Because in this work, we work with the relational felt sense, or what we call co-regulation in polyvagal theory. So much of Gendlin's work and Porges' work overlaps. And recently I sent a video to Steve of Gendlin doing a guided focusing practice. And Steve wrote me back and he said, I think Gendlin was intuitively polyvagal informed. And I said, yeah, absolutely. That's why I put the two things together. So yes, absolutely. It's a big problem because the body needs enough safety to begin to let go of those behaviors that it's using very efficiently to manage to survive in environments where it doesn't feel safe. So it's not going to let go of that. It's just not going to let go of that unless you are working with the body to coordinate what you want to do in your head with what's happening in your body. And so that's a very important piece. Yeah. What do you think about cold water exposure for regulating the body and managing anxiety using the vagus nerve? You know, some of the women in the group, even way back then, just, it's so interesting, right? How just instinctively they did those kinds of things. I don't know what Steve Porges would say about that. I think if I was sitting with a person and they told me that they did that as a way of helping themselves, and that it felt helpful in terms of, it clearly would shift the body, but does it shift to ventral or does it shift to dorsal? That's what I think is really key to know. And everybody's different. So you'd want to really get a sense of, how is that working for that person? And does the shift bring them into presence or does it bring them into numbing? That's really, I think, what matters. You mentioned IFS in the EAT Excel table. What polyvagal state is the self? Is it the flock or the flow or both? I think it's both. Yeah. You know, years and years ago, we didn't talk about IFS. We talked about parts work. And it was very much a part of what we did. And still, I love working like that. The young girl I'm working with was exposed to sexualized behavior, porn, inappropriate sexual exposure from her mother as a young child. I don't see a question there. Do you, Liam?
That was in relation to an earlier question that you
Okay. A question about autism and addictions. They are traumatized by social isolation, bullying, failure at school, and many have addictions. Yes, of course. Problem with gaming is it's available. Yes, these things are so problematic and way more now than ever, right? Because of COVID, like everybody's just inside. And yeah, I mean, absolutely. You can work with anything really with this model in the same kind of way. You know, Steve Porges has done a lot of work around autism, and on the group page in the Polyvagal Institute.org, we have groups. We have one on trauma and addiction, which is almost 1,000 people now that I facilitate, and please do join if you haven't already. There's also one with autism, and that would be a really good place to explore that question. But really autism, you know, there's the same kind of issues around the lack of connection with social engagement as with addiction. So you'd want to be doing a lot of these felt sense practices, of course, very carefully with each person in mind as a separate person. How do they work and how would that fit for them in their own body? But a lot of good research now around autism and polyvagal theory. Following brain injury, is there a particular therapeutic pathway in terms of addiction and accessing felt sense through interoception to aid trauma release? The beauty of the felt sense work and is that as soon as you start to go inside, the body will show you. The body will lead you to how it needs to work inside that particular person to bring more presence and more ventral connection. So the body leads this thing, and we support that. Where we come in particularly is if the person gets into trouble and gets triggered, right? That's a whole other story. When people get triggered, then I do become quite involved to keep safety. But all of these different things. The other one is ADD. That's another really important one that's often crossed with addictions. And learning how to listen inside and really how to teach the client to slow down, to pause, means that we as therapists have to get into our own bodies and our own felt sense, right? We have to live what we are presencing with our clients. We are our instrument. This is what we have. And we believe as embodied and polyvagal therapists that the body leads the way. And we have lots of tools we can offer, but it's a pretty generic process in terms of listening to, well, what feels right? What feels right? Let's try what feels right. Trying this. And the body will let you know, oh, that doesn't feel right. I would never splash cold water on my face. Okay. Then the body says no. Or maybe for some reason, some way that helps this person to feel more present, to feel better. I'm not going to argue with that.
Okay, Jan, I think you're really kind of great for time. I just think we're on the time. Yeah, perfect. Listen, a big thanks, Jan. I've really enjoyed tonight, and I'm really looking forward to June.
Yeah, me too.
Just a reminder to people, the 2 webinars in June, they're on the 4th and the 11th of June. And again, there's a super early bird until Sunday. So if anybody's interested in signing up, I'd really suggest you do it as soon as possible. And again, Robert has very kindly posted the link. And again, Jan, really kind of appreciating you making that tool available for free for anybody that does sign up, because I think that'll be great.
Yeah, and the all of what I showed you there is available on my website. Everything else besides the tool is free and downloadable, the body cards and all of it, janwinhall.com.
Okay.
And there's a link to my book there too.
Great. And a big thank you to Robert. Robert was in the background, keeping everything going. So thank you, Robert. It wouldn't happen without Robert. You didn't meet Mary, Jan, but we gave Mary the night off. She's been working very hard.
Yeah. So
listen, a big thanks, and I look forward to, we'll be on to you before June, but I'm really looking forward to June.
Okay.
And I think it'll be a great webinar series, and I hope we get as many people as we can, because I think I really agree with you. I think addiction treatment has, there's been too much of a focus on top-down approaches versus, bottom-up and top-down approaches. And there's a limit to what we can achieve by cognitive means, for sure.
Absolutely. Addiction lives in the body, Liam.
For sure. Okay, guys, thank you. And I hopefully we'll see people again in June. Thanks, Jan.
Oh, please do. Yeah, come back.
Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, Liam. Bye.
Bye.